Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 100 for the 29th of Adar Aleph in a leap year. Super exciting. We are in the 100th episode. I cannot believe it. I am having so much fun doing this podcast. I'm learning so much. I hope that you are as well. And I can't wait to see where everything's going to go and to continue to learn together with you. And I think it's a really great time to have this 100th episode with what we're going to be learning today. Today, again, we're going to be learning an entire chapter, and it's going to be a really powerful one. You'll see this. I actually did a little bit of research before getting on here and talking on this podcast, a little bit about quantum mechanics to give you a little insight into what kind of things we'll be talking about. So stay tuned. Before we begin, another note that I want to mention is something that one of our listeners pointed out to me, which was super informative to me. It was regarding a question that I had that maybe some of you might have as well, as to the length of these Tanya portions. So you may have noticed, I definitely noticed this, that the length of the daily portions seem to be super disproportionate, especially during a leap year. Like we'll have some days which will be literally just like a few lines. It's like, that's all we're learning. And then we have other days like today where we learn an entire chapter, which really takes up like a full few pages. So what is up with that? I didn't know. And I was really wondering about that. I knew it couldn't have been random. And so one of my listeners actually pointed out to me that the reason why this is the case, there actually is a reason, is because originally the reason why we read these daily portions and how they're divided up in such a way is because this is from the Schrodingers Rebbe. So the Schrodingers Rebbe was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was the one who decided to divide up the Tanya into these daily portions so that by the end of the year, we would have fully gone through the entire Tanya. And what he decided to do is he figured Shabbos is a really good day of learning, and he wanted his Hasidim, his followers, to learn a little bit extra on Shabbos. So on that initial year, when the Tanya was first divided up, it was divided up in such a way that the Shabbos portion would be that longer portion. And so too, in a leap year, the first leap year that it was divided up for, similarly, that was Shabbos. Shabbos was the one that would be that longer portion. So obviously the way the cycle of the years work and the way time works and everything, it doesn't always fall out on Shabbos. So every year is going to be a little bit different. So for this year, for our leap year, so the longer portion for us is Wednesdays. So if you start to notice a pattern, every Wednesday is going to be this longer portion. So Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, God wants us to learn more Tanya and extra Tanya on Wednesdays for some reason this year. So whatever, more Tanya, more good. It's really good. So yeah, so that's it. And so now with that being said, so now let's get into a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So if you noticed, I called today's episode, If a Tree Falls in a Forest. So this is an allusion to a famous philosophical quandary that you may have heard of before. It's a question people ask: if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And this is a question people discuss and talk about, and does it not, and everything. Maybe take a minute to kind of think for yourself, does it make a sound or not? And people give different arguments as to why it does or doesn't. So I'm going to spoil this quandary, this philosophical discussion, and I'm going to tell you guys that there's actually a very simple answer to this that is an unequivocal objective answer to the question. And the answer is no. The answer is it does not make a sound. How can I say this with such confidence? Because sound is a product of our perception. So the way to understand this is to really think about sound and what goes into sound being sound. And this really actually applies to pretty much all of our senses. So sound is a sense, just like everything else, just like speech or vision or things like that. So when we experience sound, what's happening is there are sound waves that get transmitted through various objects. Like right now when I'm speaking and the tone of my voice is giving out different sound waves, it's manifesting as different sound waves. However, those are just sound waves, and we cannot mistaken sound waves for sound, because it's not. Because in order for the sound waves to translate into sound, there needs to be an ear to hear them. And so this is happening right now as you're listening to my voice speak. So really, to break it down more technically, it's like I am emitting sound waves right now, and then those sound waves are getting processed. They're hitting your ear, getting processed by your ear, by your nervous system, and by a whole bunch of mechanical components, and that translates as sound into you. So if there was nobody around to hear my podcast, sure, I'm emitting sound waves, and maybe you could say, okay, well, I'm hearing my podcast, but what if I put on like really good headphones that blocked out any sound and I just kept talking and literally nobody was around to hear it? Then it actually does not produce sound. It produces sound waves for sure, but it only becomes sound once we hear it. So this is a really, really, really deep idea. And this is something that it's not just like a mind game, like philosophical question. It actually has huge impacts on reality, as we'll see. And it's a subject which science, more and more, especially in the realm of physics and especially in the realm of quantum mechanics, is really grappling with this concept of how perception actually shapes reality and actually defines what reality is. So to give a very coarse understanding of quantum mechanics, and I know that quantum mechanics tends to be so overused when people talk about chassidus and everything, but there is something to it, and it really is kind of like a very fascinating study in science, in physics, where we really see how the scientific world is kind of somewhat aligning with, or mirroring at least, some of the teachings in Chassidus. So it's really very, very interesting. And just as a disclaimer to this, I am far from an expert in any capacity. I do not have a physics degree. There's also a saying by Professor Richard Feynman, if anybody's familiar with him, who said anybody who thinks they understand quantum mechanics is just illustrating how much they do not understand quantum mechanics. So again, I have barely any kind of true grasp of this subject matter, but I'll try to give over the little bit that I know, and you'll see how this is related to the topic that we're going to be learning about, which really is all about how our perception and our consciousness truly and actually shapes reality, not in just this like woo-woo, new agey, feel good kind of way, but in an actual and objective sense. And this is what we are starting to see through quantum mechanics. So the whole idea of quantum mechanics in general and how it differs from classical mechanics. Classical mechanics was something that was more studied by Albert Einstein, which was like the study of like big bodies in the universe, like the stars and the planets and things like that, and even objects in our reality, like physical objects, like Newtonian physics is very much like this. We have a table, we have a chair, all these kind of things. Quantum mechanics is when we start to dispel things down to their more quantum level, like on a smaller scale, and we really break things down to what they're made up of. So we know everything is made up of atoms, or even we can say subatoms, like really, really, really getting to like the building blocks of all of creation. And that's what quantum mechanics studies. And the thing that's interesting about it, and this is where it gets really weird, and really scientists don't fully grasp what's happening here, is that when we study the universe through classical mechanics, through classical physics, reality appears to be very objective and very static, and appears to have this like really strong boundaries, strong measurements, things like that. But then when we start to look at the building blocks of this very same reality, all of that starts to break down and it becomes a lot more confusing. So there is a famous experiment that was done, and we can really call it a demonstration more than an experiment, because it can be done numerous times over and over. It's highly replicable. And it is called the double slit experiment. And to give a little bit of context for this, the first time that this experiment was done, it was done by somebody named Thomas Young in 1801 as a demonstration of the wave behavior of light. So it demonstrated that light behaved as a wave. What do we mean that it behaved as a wave? I just talked about sound waves before. So sound waves are clearly waves. If you really think about physical waves, it's like these waves that go up and down, like they're moving, they're constantly kind of in motion. And then there's also particles. Particles are much more static. They're much more, you can think of them as like little marbles, kind of like little bits of matter, kind of. And that is what we kind of understand when we tend to think of like physical reality, like things that are more tangible. So the question came up at that time that was discussed, is light more of a particle or is it more of a wave? And so Thomas Young and others thought that light was more of a wave, and this particular experiment seemed to demonstrate that. So how? Okay, so basically the way the experiment ran is that you had this board, and in the board there were these two slits, and then behind the board was another board that was sort of served as a screen. And the idea was that they were going to shine light through those two slits and see what manifested on that screen behind it. And whatever manifested on that screen behind it would be able to tell us if the light was actually a wave or a particle. So how would it be able to do this? So if you think about particles, let's say if the light were to behave as a particle, how would we expect a particle to behave? So if you think about it again, that these particles are like mini, like marbles, or even smaller than that, like really, really mini little balls, like grains maybe of couscous or something like that, and you're throwing them through those slots. So you're throwing at the let's say you just throw a whole bunch of them at that initial board, and it goes through the two slots, and let's say it has like this sticky substance on it so that it's able to hit that wall behind it. So then you'll look at the wall behind it and you will see a splattering of spots on one side and another on the other side, creating sort of like two vertical lines, right? That's what we would expect, is like you're throwing these little particles through the slots, and it creates this mishmash of two straight lines, maybe messy lines or whatever, but they're going to be two really defined lines. So that's what we would expect if we were to shine the light through and the light were to behave as a particle. If, on the other hand, the light were to behave as a wave, what would we expect? So think about it really as a physical wave. So what happens is a physical wave is not very static. It's actually extremely dynamic, and it literally is waving back and forth. So if you like poured a whole bunch of water, let's say you threw a bunch of water towards that screen, that initial screen, and let's say we didn't have to account for gravity, or or we just threw it with like full force, and then the water would hit the wall behind it, what you might most probably would notice is you would not have two straight lines that were like more defined. It would actually be much more of a mishmash of sorts. So I hope this is not getting too technical for you guys. Bear with me. I just find this so fascinating, but we're going to just explain a little bit why this is. Why do waves create this mishmash and particles don't? So think about waves in the ocean. So waves have two aspects to them. Waves have a peak and waves have troughs. So the peak of the wave is the high point of the wave. The trough is the lower point of the wave. And think about it, the last time that you've been at the ocean, imagine you're sitting at the ocean and there's calm waves going back and forth, and all of a sudden this wave grows, and it's this huge wave comes at you. So what makes that wave so much bigger than the other waves is because of something called interference, specifically constructive interference. Constructive interference is where you have two waves come and interact with one another, and their peaks align with one another and their troughs align with one another. And when you have the peaks of two waves or multiple waves come and interact with one another, and the troughs of multiple waves interact with one another, that just intensifies and amplifies the effect of the wave. And so that what creates that intensity. On the other hand, there's another kind of interference called destructive interference, and that is where the peak of one wave will align with the trough of another wave, and that minimizes that. They sort of cancel each other out, so to speak. So that would be like if you're at the ocean and the waves become minimized, or maybe they disappear entirely. So going back to this double slit experiment, which we've been talking about. So when the light shone through these two slits, what we found is that in them creating this more like mixed up pattern on the wall, on the back wall, which consisted of some splattering, some open space, some like more faded areas or whatever. This displayed exactly what we might expect if light were to be a wave, because just like a wave of water, it's like there's peaks and troughs and they're interacting with one another and they're creating this interference that creates this more like interesting pattern and not just like a straight line up and down. And it even made it so that there was a pattern of light, not just behind those two slits, but even in the area that there was no slit, like behind the area that was blocked off. So again, this could only happen if the light were to actually be a wave. So, okay, great. Okay, conclusion, light is a wave. Great. Next, why are we talking about this? So the reason why we're talking about this is that the physicists still got interested in delving into this deeper, and they decided to replicate this experiment by, instead of using a bunch of light and a bunch of photons and throwing that at the two slits all at once, they said, let's see what happens if we take one photon at a time, and we're still going to do multiple photons, but we're going to shoot them one at a time, either slowly or quickly, towards these two slits. And let's see what happens. Will it just go through one slit? Will it go through both slits? Will it maybe now behave as a particle? Because maybe now, because there was a theory, the reason why they decided to do this is that perhaps the photons, which are the elements of light, perhaps they really are actually particles. They're not waves, but they're behaving like waves because they're interacting with one another and like colliding and bumping into one another. So they wanted to really break this down and say, let's do them individually, one at a time, and see what happens then. And what they found, lo and behold, is that even when they shot the photons one at a time towards this wall, this barrier of the two slits, it still very much behaved as a wave. And it was very curious because it seemed to be going through both slits, even though it was merely one photon. And then it still created this interference in the back. So what appeared to be happening is that this photon was interacting with itself, was interfering with itself, and that somehow it actually split into two before going into these two slits, and that it reemerged and recombined when it came back from the two slits and interfered with itself. So the physicists became really curious about all of this, and they decided to take a closer look as to see what's going on, to see at what point was the photon actually splitting. At what point did it suddenly take on the characteristics of a wave? Like, what was actually happening here? So they set up a camera to watch the trajectory of the photons as they would come towards the barrier with the slits. And they found the most curious and amazing thing. And this is what has shocked the world of quantum mechanics and physics and science in general, and nobody's really been able to this day to be able to come to an understanding of why this is. But when they set up the camera to observe the photons as they were coming towards the barrier with the slits, all of a sudden the photon changed the way it behaved, and it started to behave like a particle, like an actual particle, to the point that now if you looked at that wall behind the barrier, it had those two very much more defined and orderly strips that you might imagine if you were to shoot particles through these two slits. So this is like really crazy. And this has been replicated multiple times. There are ways to replicate this yourself even, and it's incredible. And what it really seemed to demonstrate is that the mere act of observation changes the way that an light behaves. It changes light from behaving like a wave to behaving like a particle. And this has been shown not only with light, by the way, this is a topic for another time, but it's been shown with electrons and matter and like really the entire basis of our universe. And the implications of this are really quite crazy because why? Because if we want to understand the idea of wave and particle in another way, maybe in a more philosophical sense, but still very much true to reality, is that we can think of waves as sort of like being like probabilities, whereas particles are a little bit more like static defined events. So what I mean by this is that if you think about this, so on that back wall behind the two slits, this is like sort of like the finished product, right? This is like where we're going to have our splattering of dots, whether it is wave dots that had interference or particle dots that didn't have interference. This is like the final product of what we're left with. But what that final product is going to look like, nobody really knows. I mean, if it's particles, then we do know. If it's particles, we can clearly measure, okay, it's going to look exactly like this. But when it comes to waves, we don't know which wave is going to interact with which wave and at what degree, at what angle or whatever. There's absolutely no way of predicting that. And when they shot the photon through like one photon at a time towards this two slit barrier, there was no way to know, is it going to go through that slit or is it going to go through that slit? So the idea basically is that on a certain level, before it actually hit, without the observer being present, and when you just let the light travel in its own way, it's actually behaving in a probabilistic kind of manner, meaning to say that there is a certain amount of probability that the light will go through the first slit. There's a certain amount of probability the light will go through the second slit. And then there's another amount of probability that it will not go through any slit at all. And then once it reaches that final wall, then it's like, okay, here, this is what we've decided. This is where the problem, and it's a big mishmash versus what once a person actually observes this, and it doesn't even have to be a person, by the way, it can be a machine. They've demonstrated this in different ways, that even if there's not a human observer, but there's just some kind of observer of some kinds there, once you put an observer into the equation of what's going on, it's no longer a probability anymore. It's an actual defined event. So one way to try to understand this is, I mean, I have to mention Schrodinger's cat because I feel like it was like, how could I not in this case? Some of you may be familiar with this experiment, though I do have some questions about it, and I don't know if it blows my mind as much as some of this other stuff. But the basic premise of Schrodinger's cat is that you have a cat that's in a box, and in this box, there's this certain radioactive material that is set to go off at a random time that nobody knows. And the second that the radioactive material goes off, this will elicit this poison to be emitted and kill the cat. And so when this cat is inside the box and the observers are outside of the box, the observers have absolutely no way of knowing whether the cat is dead or alive, because again, remember, the radioactive substance can go off at any time and it's 100% totally random. And so at that moment, if we want to say, is the cat dead or alive? It's both. It's both dead and alive, because until we actually open up the box, we cannot say that the cat is dead or alive, because there's absolutely no way to measure it. I think maybe another way to understand this is maybe just in a more mundane, regular kind of way, is like, let's say I am on any given day, like let's say my day today, I have my full day ahead of me, and it's in the morning when I record these podcasts, and I have a lot of choices of what I can do today. I could do yoga. I could go to the store. I could go ice skating. I could go to visit my friends. Like there's a million different probabilities here of what I could do. And right now, which one is future me doing? Well, future me could be doing all of those things. There's a million different potentials. And if we wanted to put probability on it, we could say, well, okay, what is the probability that I'm going to go skiing today, given the fact that I've never gone skiing and it's not something I usually do. I have no way of getting there or whatever, versus the probability that I'll do yoga. So obviously the probability that I'll do yoga is a lot higher than the probability that I'll go skiing, but it's still very much a probability until it's very much defined. And so this is the idea of probability. And the only time something becomes an exact event is once I do it. So once I finish this podcast, I go about my day and I do whatever it is that I do, then you can say, this is the thing that I am doing. But the element that quantum mechanics brought into the equation that was really interesting is that it's not even about what will happen in the future, that at that moment, that's when it becomes defined. It's the mere act of somebody observing the probability of what's happening that gives it a defined entity, that gives it a definition. So I hope this was not too abstract for you guys. I would like to get into the Tanya now and explain why it is that I went onto this whole big tangent. And the reason why is because today's Tanya is really all about our perception of reality and how our perception of reality can actually shift and change objective reality in a really true way. And how this is something that God asks of us to do. And not only is it something that we are asked to do, it's actually in a certain sense the central point and like the essence of what it means to be Jewish, and kind of like encompasses the entire Torah. So it's kind of a big deal if you think about it, that really, how could that be that our perception and focus is actually all we need to do? And if we shift our focus and we shift our perception, that is going to actually fulfill reality in the fullest way, the way that God wants us to, and fulfill our mission on earth. So sounds really crazy, right? So I would like to get straight into the text now and just see how the Alter Rebbe breaks it down, and maybe through keeping all these things in mind of what we talked about so far about perception and reality and quantum mechanics, see if you can kind of connect the dots on your own and see why this topic really came to mind for me. And then maybe we'll discuss it a little bit more at the end of the chapter. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins this chapter 33, and he says that this is another way to come to a joy of the soul, a true joy of the soul, specifically when you find in yourself at certain times that you need to refine yourself and to brighten it and radiate your soul with the joy of the heart. So once again, the preceding chapters that we had up until chapter 32, really, which was the last chapter, was a lot about self-reflection and contemplation and really being self-critical in a certain way, in a certain sense. And so all of this self-criticism we talked about might lead a person down this path of not feeling so good about themselves, not so happy. And so for the advice for this is to deepen in their mind and in their thoughts the idea of the unity of God, of true unity, in the sense of really to put the focus on God, basically, and to think about how God is within all the worlds, higher and lower worlds, and even fills our world with his glory, and everything exists as if not and nothing in comparison to him. And he is alone in the upper and in the lower worlds for real, just like he was alone before the 6 days of creation. So God did not change at all. And even in the space of this world, which God created, meaning to say the heavens and the earth and all of their heavenly hosts, there was only him and him alone that filled that space. And so too now, nothing changed. It's still only him and him alone, because all of the creations of God are all totally nullified to him, just like the nullification of the letters of speech and the letters of thought in their source and in their origin and in their root. Meaning to say that the letters of thought and speech, like we talked about this previously, are nullified in the essence of the soul, which are its 10 aspects. Chokhmah, Bina, Das, remember, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, all of these, the 10 faculties of the soul, which we spoke about. So if you recall, we talked about this in previous episodes. Please go back and listen to them if you can for more review. But basically how, if you think about your thought or your speech, all of these things, your thought and your speech really has no existence of its own. It's totally and utterly nullified to you. So what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that the same way that our thought and our speech is nullified to the essence of who we are, so too are all of the worlds that God created, and the heavens and the earth and everything, including our world, are similarly nullified to God. Because we see that, for example, like in terms of thought or speech, they don't actually have letters at all before they become vested in the vestment of thought. And then the Alter Rebbe writes in brackets here, he says, as is explained in chapter 20 and chapter 1 at length. So go back and review those two chapters. And for your convenience, I've actually looked up the exact dates of what those chapters, when we spoke about those chapters, so you can go back to previous podcasts to look it up. So it was from the 11th of Shvat up until the 16th of Shvat in a leap year. So you can go back and search those episodes if you want a little bit more of a review on this whole idea of how our thought and our speech is really nullified to us, and how we understand how this is a good metaphor for us to help us understand God and how God works with all of this. And then the Alter Rebbe brings a different metaphor for this, which is a very common metaphor that's brought in Chassidus a lot. It might be familiar to some of you, which is the idea of how the ray of sunlight And the light of the sun, the radiance of the sun, is nullified to its source, which is the body of the sun itself that is in the heavens, in the firmament. Because what this means is that even within the body of the sun itself, there still is the radiance. This radiance of the sun shines within itself. Like where is it coming from? It's coming from itself. So the radiance and the light shines even greater within itself, even greater than how it manifests to the outside in the void of the world. But the only difference is that when you think about shining like a ray of the sunlight into itself, it becomes totally nullified to its source, as if it doesn't exist at all. So like if we were to theoretically be able to go into the sun, would we be able to point out like, oh, look, there's a ray of sunlight, there's a ray of sunlight? We wouldn't be able to do that, because it's like the whole sun is the ray of sunlight. Like that's the source of where the ray of sunlight comes from. And so the Alter Rebbe says that this is exactly what it's like, by way of metaphor, the nullification of the world and all of it in comparison to its source, which is the infinite light of God. So, again, this is explained at length back in those two chapters, chapter 20 and 21, the Alter Rebbe says. And so now the Alter Rebbe says, so this whole, why is he bringing this up now? Why is he reminding us and reviewing this whole aspect of how everything is really nullified in God? Is because when a person really deepens into this and meditates upon this, this will bring them to great joy and rejoicing of the soul, to the point of really rejoicing and singing with his entire heart and soul, with this great emunah, this great faith. Why would this lead the person to great joy? Because this experience of faith, this experience of like this awareness, faith is like sort of not the best translation for emunah and what we're trying to convey, but it's sort of like a deep sense of awareness, a deep consciousness of the fact of the all-encompassing nature of God. This is like a very deep and close expression of being close to God. And if you recall, we talked about the whole idea of sadness. And what is sadness? Sadness is the experience of being far away from your creator, far away from your source. So when you have this awareness of how your creator actually is everywhere and everything's encompassed in the creator, this should lead a person to experience a great, tremendous sense of joy and happiness. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that this is actually the entire purpose of why we're created and why all of the worlds were created, whether we're talking about the higher worlds or the lower worlds. It was in order to for God to have a dwelling place for himself in the lower worlds, as we will talk about further at length going forward in the Tanya. And this is this time a little teaser of what's to come in chapter 36, where we're going to talk about that more, about the purpose of the world and why the world was created. But the Alter Rebbe is bringing it up here now, and he's saying that really the whole reason why the world was created was in order to make a dwelling place for God in this world. And the way we do that is really by cultivating this consciousness of how God is everywhere. And then the Alter Rebbe brings this out through a metaphor of how great will a person's joy be if imagine if you had like a simple person, a very lowly kind of person, the most lowliest of person, if they came close to a physical king of flesh and blood, and that physical king of flesh and blood hosted them and let them stay there and all of those things. So obviously, like let's say if you took a homeless person off the street and then the king invited them into their home and said, come stay in the palace with me, the homeless person most likely would be really overjoyed, right? So this is basically what's happening with us, is that when we realize that we are living in God's palace, in God's home, this should lead us to a tremendous, a much higher level of gladness, of joy than that experienced by the homeless person being brought in to live with the physical king. And for this, the Alter Rebbe brings a citation from Yirmiyahu chapter 30, verse 21, where it says, Ki mihu zeh asher arav libo lageshet elai neum Hashem, which literally translates to mean, for who is the man who dares to approach me, says God. So it's like sort of like this paradox of like, on the one hand, God is this like amazing, tremendous king that's almost like untouchable, it feels like, but yet this untouchable, tremendous, awesome, whatever you want to call it, king, we're actually living in his palace and we're actually living in his home. So that should bring us to a sense of tremendous joy and rejoicing. And this is why the Alter Rebbe says it was instituted that every single morning when we are praying in the morning, we start off our prayers, if you ever notice this in the morning prayers, to praise his name and to say Ashrenu Matov Chelkenu, which means how happy are we? How lucky are we that with our lot? Like, what a great lot we have. What a great inheritance we've been given. That means what a great inheritance we've been given, meaning to say that just like a person would be really excited about getting a physical inheritance that they would get. So we talked about this again also previously, like how exciting would it be if you suddenly found out, wow, you were just left $1 million by a relative or something like that. So this is really what God gave us. He gave us this amazing inheritance, which we didn't have to work for. So the inheritance God gave us is so much greater than any kind of physical reward or anything like that. And what that is the unity of the true God, and that who even in this lowest of the worlds, in our physical earth, which is considered to be the lowest of the lowest worlds, there is still nothing but him. And this is his dwelling place here. And this is why the sages taught us that Habakkuk came and he said it's true that there are 613 mitzvahs that were given to the Jewish people, but Habakkuk said that he put them all in one. He said all it is, we can sum up all 613 of these mitzvahs in one mitzvah, in one statement, which is Tzaddik be'emunato yichyeh, which literally means a righteous person will live off of his emunah, off of his faith. So what does this mean? Because like you could say believing in God, having faith in God, that's one mitzvah. So what do we mean that it's all 613 of the mitzvahs? So what he was trying to say is that through this keeping, if somebody really, really cultivates and develops and becomes aware of this deep sense of belief and faith in God, this will lead them to keep all of the other 613 mitzvahs. Because once a person develops this joy out of this faith in the unity of God with utmost joy, and if a person really taps into this mitzvah in like a really, really true way, in a way as if this was like the only mitzvah that a person had to do, then from the power of this mitzvah and from the vitality that will come into his soul out of this joy that will come, like when a person cultivates this godly awareness, this godly consciousness, their soul will rise up above against all the obstacles that come in the way of keeping the 613 commandments, whether they are coming from the inside or from the outside. So any kind of barriers, any kind of resistance that a person might have experienced previously to keeping God's Torah, to keeping the 613 mitzvahs, they'll just vanish when a person really taps into this true faith. And this is why the Alter Rebbe says, it says that a person will live off of faith, that the righteous person will live off of faith. What does this mean, that the person will live off of faith? It's an allusion to Tchias HaMesim, which is the revival of the dead, the resurrection of the dead, by way of analogy. So just like in like a physical kind of resurrection of the dead, this is how the soul will be resurrected with this joy. So it's like almost like being reborn when a person cultivates this kind of joy. And it is a doubled and redoubled joy. Because why? Why is it doubled and redoubled? What do we mean by this? Is because in addition to this joy of the soul that cultivates this consciousness of being close to God and being in his dwelling place, like a person develops this awareness of, oh, wow, I'm living in God's home right now. A person will be doubly happy by realizing God's happiness. So why is God happy? Because God is getting nachas from our awareness. So God gets tremendous nachas when we recognize him, when we recognize that he is here and we recognize that we are in his dwelling place and we have this faith in him. This pushes away the sitra achra, this other side, in a real way. And then the darkness turns into light, which is the darkness of the klipos that are in this world, this physical world, that conceal the light of God. And they will continue to conceal God until the end of times, until the final days, quote unquote. Basically, the final days is like after Mashiach comes, basically. The end of times, we call them, different names for it, and the next world, whatever. So because what will happen then at the end of times, then God is going to put an end to the darkness. And then in brackets, the Alter Rebbe elaborates on what we mean by this end of times. This is at the end of days when the spirit of impurity will be banished from the earth, and then the glory of God will be manifest, and all flesh together will experience him and will see him as he truly is. So I just want to interject here, if you haven't caught on yet, that this is where this relationship to quantum mechanics really hit me is at this point where the Tanya is basically saying and telling us that when we develop a certain consciousness about and awareness of our lives and God and the world and all of that stuff, it's not just changing our consciousness, it's actually changing physical reality, is what the Alter is teaching us here, is that it actually serves to clear up some of this darkness that is in the world and that conceals God. So to go back to the text, so then the Alter Rebbe says that, and this is especially true in the world, in the lands outside of Israel. It's called like idolatrous lands. Why? Because the land outside of Israel is the air is very impure and it's full of klipos and sitra achra from the other side. And there's no greater joy for God like the light and the joy that comes from darkness. As you know, we explained this before in terms of human sadness and the joy that comes out of human sadness, or the light that comes out of darkness, and how much greater that light or that joy is. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings a citation from Tehillim, chapter 149, verse 2, which says, Yismach Yisrael bosav, which literally translates to let Israel rejoice in its maker. So there's many different ways to refer to God. And here it refers to God specifically as its maker, osav, which comes from the word of asiya, rather than creator, because it could have said we rejoice, God, Israel rejoices in its creator, but specifically use the word maker, which comes from the word asiya. And as we'll see, the word asiya, those of you who might know this already, or if you recall, we talked about it before, the world of action, the world of making, so to speak, asiya is the lowest world, which is the world in which we are in. And so the Alter Rebbe says that this is the whole idea, that anybody who comes from the lineage of the Jewish people, anybody who comes from Israel, should really rejoice in the joy of God, and the fact that God is rejoicing so much, and he is rejoicing and really happy in this dwelling place here, which is in a way of actual physical asiya, actual physical action, like this physical world that we're talking about. And this is why it says osav. Osav means in his makings, and that's in plural, because that's referring to this physical world, which is full of klipot and sitra achra. Like there's a lot of multiplicity here, and it's called reshus harabim even, which this is a reference to a term that comes up with Hilchos Shabbos about like the public domain versus the private domain, and how the public domain, what we're talking about here in terms of that, is just that it's like an area of like a lot of multiplicity, and there's mountains of separation, but nevertheless we took them and we switched it to light, and they became the private domain. So we took these things from the public domain into the private domain for the sake of God's unity out of this faith. So that is the end of that chapter. I know it was a lot, and hopefully you made the connection to what I talked about in the beginning, but I'll try to bring it together now as well. So basically what we learned in today's episode, in today's chapter, is all about this idea of developing a consciousness of God, and working on our God consciousness, and working on cultivating this faith that we all have within us, but really, really becoming more aware of it. And we talked about how by developing this faith and this awareness of the facts that really, truly everything in the world, literally every single thing, is truly ultimately nullified to God, and that we are visitors in God's world, in God's palace. This should lead us to a feeling of great joy when we recognize this awareness of how close we are to our source. And then this should also bring us to an awareness of the fact that when we have this awareness, this causes God to rejoice, because finally somebody's recognizing him. And through this recognition, this actually kind of clears and pulls apart the layers in a very physical way, in a way that becomes much more real in this world of revealing the hidden. And this will be truly experienced in the future times when the darkness really is eradicated from the world. But while we may not be able to see this in a revealed way, this is what we are actually doing through our actions here, specifically through cultivating this consciousness. So it really is, it's a very spiritual kind of chapter, in the sense that it's not actually telling us to actively give charity, put on tefillin, keep Shabbos, all of those things. But it's sort of like going back to the root and the source of all of it. And it's sort of like saying that, like, let's start at the beginning. Let's go back into trying to cultivate an awareness of God, a God consciousness. And by virtue of doing this, not only will it bring us to great joy, but it will also, the the ramifications of it is that we're going to keep God's commandments, because when we truly live with this consciousness of God, there will be no obstacles to doing God's will, because that's just like the logical continuation of that. That's what a person who lives with God consciousness would do. It's like, then you just fulfill God's will and you serve as a chariot for God. And through living this way, this brings great joy to God as well, and really transforms the universe. So to bring it back to the introduction in the beginning that I spoke about quantum mechanics and all this, to me, this is, I don't think it's too much of a leap to say that I think that science is really starting to come to an awareness of what the Tanya is teaching us, namely that our consciousness can actually shape and mold reality. So if you think back to that example again about the two slits in the experiment and everything, and how the light transforms from a wave into a particle, and how it's not really something static and it has infinite possibilities. That's basically what we're learning about here in the Tanya, is this idea that we have our thoughts, we have our consciousness, and we have a choice as to how we want to direct this consciousness. And when we direct our consciousness and we choose to see the world in a certain way, this can literally make the world into what it is that we are choosing to see. We can choose to live in this world which overtly seems to conceal God and be filled with all this multiplicity, but by merely focusing our thoughts, by merely focusing on the idea that the true reality is really this unified godly place, that can actually transform it so that that actually really does become the case. So I hope that was enlightening. I hope it was not too esoteric and you were able to connect some of the dots. And we will continue tomorrow. We will move on to chapter 32. I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.